Hey everybody, I am going to go over the brain differences. I haven't covered this yet, but I've been trying to make a list and watch more and more videos, and I'm going to post in the description the video that I got most of these differences from. And we're going to find more and more and the interplay between them, between the left and right hemispheres of our brain over time. But this gives you an idea of where I've got all this information from and like the connections that I made. If you can make the connections yourself, then it makes it a lot more tangible and real for you, especially when I can post it. The neuroscientist who has done 30 years of this research and figured out these differences. So in doing so, like I didn't have to do any of this. Like I've just made the connections. So I didn't do a lot of this work. And obviously my interests led me to this path. So I just drew the connections again. I shouldn't be the one everyone looks to and says, oh, he's the one that came up with this. It's like, no, I just drew the connections between it all. Like my right hemisphere just exploded and saw all these connections and the relationship between everything. And the thing is Iaian Mcgilchrist himself says that he doesn't associate the left hemisphere with science, but I see the pattern that he's laid out between the left and right hemisphere, and like obviously the right hemisphere is involved in science, but only so far as to make the connections necessary for the left hemisphere to try to solve that problem. So the right hemisphere is making the connections, it's forming that synthesis, and then once the synthesis is formed, again, I think I elaborated this on another video, and then the left hemisphere comes with, it like sends that information and it tries to come up with a conclusion or a solution for that problem or synthesis. So it's like, here's a rationalization based on what you just told me. Like, here's the two things. Let me try to rationalize a synthesis between them and come up with a solution for that. So your left hemisphere is the emissary in doing so. And yet, so that means they're both involved. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows up to this point, I've been making an extreme case for the left and right hemisphere so as to understand the dichotomies we're dealing with. Because again, dichotomology is all based on rationalizing the extreme and then understanding where in this equilibrium, or where is this equilibrium at within this dichotomy. And I would say it's like with our brain, the equilibrium should be slightly right justified. So we should lean a little bit more towards our right hemisphere's way of thinking. And our society right now is not doing that. We are very left hemisphere dominant. And you're going to see very soon the connections that I drew and how it all kind of makes sense. Like it all fits together nicely once you understand the hemispheric differences. So the divided brain. Understanding the divided brain involves recognizing the distinct characteristics of each hemisphere and rationalizing their extremes. Again, I rationalize them. It's not true of reality, but it's useful for us to understand and simplify what's going on. So the work of Iaian Mcgilchrist, particularly summarized in his discussion that I'm going to post in the description below, and provided resources, offers profound insights into these differences. So a summary of the brain differences. The brain is asymmetric both in function and structure. So that means it's bifurcated, which means it's split in the middle, and then each side, it's asymmetric. So in each area, one's going to be larger than the other side, and so that means it's lateralized also. So asymmetric means it's not quite balanced. Like each side has different sizes for each of the different portions. So one size will be large, the other side will have a smaller area. And if the other side has a larger area, the other side will have a smaller area. So it's asymmetric. It's not perfectly the same size on each side. And then it's lateralized. So it's bifurcated, asymmetrical, and then lateralized. So each side is responsible for different things. So I didn't include all three of those things, but those are the three characteristics of your brain. Bifurcated, asymmetrical, different sizes, and then lateralized. So there's different characteristics that each side takes care of. There's different ways of thinking each side takes care of, and different attentions that they pay. So the summary of the brain differences. The brain is asymmetrical in both function and structure. The corpus callosum, which connects our two hemispheres, it runs along the base of our two hemispheres and connects them both, has been observed to proportionally smaller over evolutionary time. So our brain has grown in size while it's basically stayed more or less the same size, if not gotten smaller in respect to our overall brain size. So the ratio of size of the corpus callosum hasn't grown in proportion with our left and right hemisphere, meaning that there's very little information that it needs to actually communicate and or inhibit from the other hemisphere. So in understanding that, it kind of leads us to the conclusion, like, hey, it doesn't really need this excess information. Like, as you keep getting smarter and smarter and understanding the world better and better, you can really just operate on one of these two trains of thought and kind of be somewhat successful. So that's more or less what we can take away from it. But in reality, if you can incorporate both, then you grasp reality. Like, you can understand and grasp, comprehend and apprehend reality to a much higher degree. So you'll be able to think so much deeper. You'll be able to think so much more specific and deeper, and order and chaos and like all these different aspects of our reality. You'll be able to think so much more critically about. And that's kind of why people used to say, it's like, how did they know these things? It's like, well, your right hemisphere is actually smarter. It's where your IQ, most of your IQ comes from, is the connections between things. That's why IQ tests are about the relationship between different patterns rather than 1 + 1 = 2. It's not like rationalizations most of the time. Most of it is drawing connections and patterns, which is of the right hemisphere. But the left hemisphere is also useful in those. So it's kind of like you want to interplay between both and to utilize both as much as possible. Okay, so here are some of the differences, a list. So the right hemisphere is often misunderstood as being flighty and fanciful and going off into la la land, but it can. So if you draw too many connections, you can draw too many connections between things that aren't necessarily interrelated in the way that you're trying to rationalize. And that's why the left hemisphere is like when it hears religious thinkers, it's like, this is too many connections. Like, we want to simplify this to where we see how does this drug affect your body? Like, when you swallow this Tylenol, like it's not going to affect your dog. It's not going to affect, like, obviously it could affect your dog because it would affect you. You can treat your dog differently, but that's how your right brain thinks. It's like, how does your Tylenol taking this affect your relationships to everything else? But your left hemisphere is like, okay, how does this Tylenol actually mechanically, and what is the process by which it affects you and changes you that could lead to a good outcome or a bad outcome? And obviously we're not taking everything into account. So in just saying that it relieves the symptoms of your headache, well, it's like, why did you have the headache? Was it because having the headache would lead you to not do certain things or to do certain things that you need to do? Is it one of your intuitions, your body speaking to you to tell you like you need to deal with something? So that's where like religious people are saying, I don't like drugs. I don't like the idea or concept of drugs and all these other things, that we aren't taking enough things into account. But one of the differences is like, if we know a disease is very deadly and giving people the shot will get rid of that disease, rather than us having to go through the suffering and process of mass immunization naturally, which would mean like people die off and whoever becomes immune to it naturally is the ones that survive. We just inject this weakened version of it so people can overcome it much easier and add it to their repertoire of things that they are immune to. So it's like a weakened version of the disease. So it's not that I don't think religious people are saying they don't like that idea, but they don't like the idea where it's a sped up process where here's immunization. We don't know enough about it. We don't know how it affects all these other aspects of our lives. And like, this is a rushed technology and a rushed medicine within that technology. So we need to be very careful where we go, especially if it's a germline editing, where it's going to affect the next generation forever. we need to be very careful because we don't have a full understanding or full comprehensive knowledge of how that's going to affect our germline and our offspring in perpetuity. Because changing these things, that's a result of 4 billion years of evolution across billions of different contexts. Like, we don't have enough variables in our small brains to take all of that into account. And that's what people on the right hemisphere would argue. And I haven't even gotten to the first characteristic. It's been 10 minutes. Sorry, guys. But this is like, these are all the connections that I keep drawing when it comes to these. So if you can think in that way, then you can understand this is how the left and right hemisphere thinks. So the right hemisphere is often understood as flattening and fanciful. It exhibits both and thinking. So it takes everything, tries to take as many things into account, and it says it's probably both of these things, honestly. And it's the truth. There's no situation where the only consequences are going to be the result of one thing. It's going to affect something else, which is why there's no such thing as perfect morality. It's impossible. It's impossible to achieve perfect morality. We can only get as close to it as possible, which is very difficult for people to accept. And it's going to be kind of fluid within that range. So it's not like here's the exact point. It's that here's a band or a width that we should all try to achieve. But in that, there's a little bit of play for the context or situation. And that's how people should think about it. Like morality, like, you know, I like my video about the 7 deadly sins. It's not, I should only take gluttony into account, or I should only take the opposite, which would be like abstinence. So I should not be gluttonous or abstinent, but I should try to find it based on the context, which is my genetics, my environment, like what can I eat, my understanding of all that. It's like, take as many things into account and then come to a solution based on your own specifics. And that's how you're going to come to the right conclusion. Like, if you can only eat rice, well, it's like, I have to try to prevent myself from overindulging in this, but like, you're going to be unhealthy. You're not going to be able to, you're not have all the nutrients your body needs, but like, you can probably live off rice for a while before you start having actual physical conditions as a result of it. So both and thinking, it's attention to what is present. So it's always present. Its attention is wide and broad, sustained, coherent, and vigilant. It deals in realism, so it doesn't rationalize anything. It won't try to make sense of things. It understands that there's no perfect answer for anything, and it tries to take as many things into account. So, which I think is like biblical thinking. It's like, you're not necessarily saying here's the perfect answer. It's saying here's things that we've figured that people took into account, and it makes sense for you to as well. And they wanted you to understand that, not necessarily like this is exactly what God wanted you to do specifically to the T. Those are rationalizations. Those are of the devil. And that's why I think anybody who thinks they have the exact interpretation of the Bible, or that they're giving you those specifics rather than saying take as much of this into account as possible, they're not telling you the full picture, or they don't even understand what they're preaching or trying to get the message they're trying to get across. And that's my argument for that. So appreciation for uniqueness, melody, harmony, and time. It's where we get our sense of humor and our understanding of reading body language. So we can see the patterns involved in body language, and your right brain will pick up on that pattern. It's like, I can tell this person's lying, or I can, like, you don't rationalize it. You don't like go step by step. The person moved his left arm, the person moved his right arm, then his eyes went to the side. No, that is not how body language reading works. It's of your right hemisphere. It just takes all of what's happening in the context, everything into account, and then it spits it out at you, like plainly, like, this is my conclusion, and it throws it to your left hemisphere, and your left hemisphere is like, oh shit, I can tell that guy's lying. That's how it works. It's weird, but it's cool. So, sustained attention for survival mechanism. So it detects mates, offsprings, and predators. So if you think about it, it's like religious thinkers, again, they think about they try to take as much stuff into account. They think about their family, their friends, their offspring. They look out for predators everywhere. They're like, I don't want any predators to be involved. I want to protect my my society. I want to protect everything. They're like a sheepdog. Like that's how you can think of the right hemisphere. It's like in its most, in a healthy form. It is the sheepdog brain. Like this is how you think of it. It's like protective. It detects, it makes sure that everything is taken care of. Its attention's broad, sustained, coherent. It's vigilant. It looks out for predators. It's looking out for everybody. And understands the contextual whole. It recognizes the interconnectedness and understands that everything is a flowing, changing process. And it emphasizes context. So in understanding the context, you can understand all the dynamic that's at play. So the right hemisphere, taking as many things into account. That's how you can think of it. It's like holistic. But it also lacks a voice. So you're going to see it in either images. You're going to see it in images. It's going to come to you in emotions. That's why people say the right hemisphere is more emotional, because that's how it communicates. It communicates in these feelings, these intuitions. And that's why I call the right brain of the intuitionists. Like that is what it is. It communicates in intuitions, whatever that may be, whatever you perceive it as, like everything. It's like the holistic understanding of how this makes you feel. But it lacks a voice. So you cannot, like anytime you hear your voice in your head, it's your left hemisphere speaking. And you could say it's the devil, or what if you're religious, or you can say it's the voice of all the other characteristics I'm going to list off. But your right hemisphere is what opens your mind and actually understands the way the world works. Okay, so left hemisphere. People say it's unemotional and dependable, but this isn't the case. So everything the left hemisphere does is recreate a representation of the world. So it's not actually a one-to-one map. It's as close as it can get. And obviously IQ is going to change this. So like the closer you can get to mapping the actual world is the closer your brain is correlating the map with the actual world. And it makes things that are useful. So that map is useful. And it simplifies things. Makes them coherent. Makes it tangible. So it's either or thinking. So the way I've laid out dichotomies in dichotomology, it cannot think in that way. It'll only rationalize the extremes. That's all that makes sense to the left hemisphere. So when it's like, you can either have pride or you can have the opposite. Like what do you mean you can try to integrate both? Like that's not something it thinks. It tries to find that finite, simplified solution of one or the other. So it's either or. It can't be both. And that's how left hemispheric people rationalize things and confuse people that have that way of thinking. It's like, I know the answer. I don't have all the answers, says the right hemisphere, but the left hemisphere is like, I do. So anybody that has all the answers is probably of the left hemisphere, and they're probably going to see a lot of these other things as a result. And obviously, it's not like people are one-to-one. It's not like there's left hemisphere only individuals and right hemisphere only individuals. It's more of how much, there's a left and right hemisphere, where along it how many things in your life and how much do you utilize your right hemisphere versus your left hemisphere? And a very good example of, I would say, extreme left hemisphere only thinking would be like Hitler or Mao or Stalin. Like the people that only take very little into account. They're systematic in thinking, they're logical, they're rational. Those are all of the left hemisphere as well. So literalism, rationalism, again, attention as a representation rather than actual what's present. Preference for theory over experience. So it's like you had a feeling, like facts over feelings, right? Well, it's like those feelings and intuitions you have, they're the results of 4 billion years of evolution. Like there's no way your 40, 50 years of experience on the world is smarter than 4 billion years of me understanding that there's something wrong here. And that's what a lot of women these days think. They've had these feelings, but they can't quite articulate them because men are much more of the left hemisphere while women are much more of the right. And women have a hard time, they can draw those conclusions really well, but then they have to communicate through this little tiny brain, and then it leads to the left hemisphere, and it's like, I don't know how to rationalize this. This is too much. So, but men are already like, I have all the answers. So this is your problem, and here's the solution. So, and then women are like, oh, that's not what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to communicate much more than that. But again, your right hemisphere doesn't have a voice. All it has is those intuitions. And oh my gosh, it kind of makes me sad how much women have been like, I wouldn't say abused, but like how much of it's been suppressed, the beautifulness and how much intuition has been ignored in our society. And like women have been beat down like by this rationalist perspective of the left hemisphere. It's like so good at just destroying intuitions, like destroying the fact that we have these ways of thinking, that because that's another aspect of it, is it likes to maintain control. Like if it doesn't have control, it just wants to keep regaining it. And that's what happens in our societies as they decay, is like the more and more control you try to implement over the system, over the people, over everything, is the degree to which the left hemisphere is taking over. And I wouldn't say necessarily that we need a reset, but as long as we like educate people on the differences between the hemispheres, I think that's how we make sure that we don't fall victim to it and we can reach to heaven. Once we as a society accept dichotomology as being truthful, then we'll understand that this is how people need to think in order to properly prevent themselves from becoming perfectly left hemispheric in thinking. And I've never seen an example of a perfectly right hemispheric way of thinking, or like going towards that. And because if you, they're like, is there anything wrong with taking more things into account? It's like, no, like sometimes you take too much, but it's like taking another thing into account isn't really going to hurt anyone. It's like, I guess it does. It's possible to take too many things into account and then not be able to come to an answer, because you could just keep going forever and be like, I can never come to an answer for this. I can never solve this problem. But that would just kind of be a delayed issue, because eventually somebody with a little more left hemispheric thinking will be like, I know the solution to that. And it's like, maybe it's not a perfect solution, but we'll compromise and synthesize over time to find that. And that's why like any new technology, it comes out, it's absolute garbage. But as they continue to iterate and improve on it, and people believe in the technology and what it can do and transform the world, that's when they eventually get to it. So like anything you can think of, I don't know any technology that wasn't crap when we first started trying to make it. That's why you made prototypes. People improve the prototypes before they even make a manufacturable version of it. And the manufacturable version still has issues. And then obviously everybody's like rejecting it because it's like, oh, we saw these issues with it. Okay, so it's manipulative talents. So one of them is maintaining control, right? So it maintains control, but it can make things manipulative. It can simplify things to make it manipulative, give it the ability to manipulate it. So that's both abstract concepts and tangible things in the real world. So again, it sees specifics. So when people are judging each other for their hair, this is how it's doing that. It's simplifying them to the specifics of their hair or their nails or whatever other aspect of their body. That's of your left hemisphere. And that's what people is like judgments, right? Like you're being judgmental. You're being, you can say manipulative in a way. Like if you're judging someone based on their hair, maybe you're trying to change the hairstyle, and like you're being materialistic in nature too, because the material aspect of that person doesn't necessarily matter. It's like their soul, who they are, like what they're doing for the world, like all these other aspects that you're not accounting for. You're just judging them based on one specific materialistic aspect that doesn't really matter in the end, because our hair is going to go away, but our soul and the way we treat each other is going to go, it's going to echo through eternity. So if you believe, or however long you believe that societies will be around, so it's going to echo through that. And so the way we treat each other needs to be more right hemispheric in thinking, like relational, love, etc. It has an unrealistic optimism. So it thinks that when it sees an answer, it's what's like makes you feel so elated. It's like, oh yeah, like, or like it feels like anything is accomplishable, right? But there's certain limitations. Again, we're limited by the extremes of the dichotomous ends of things. We are limited by that. So no matter what we do, it's impossible to achieve those in reality. And as long as we take that into account, everything within the spectrums is possible, which there's an infinite number of things within that spectrum. So as long as we're bounded by what's possible in reality, we can understand that there's an infinite possibilities within that spectrum of limited possibilities, which is, it's awesome that the world works that way. There's unlimited and limited possibilities, which is crazy to think about. Detail oriented at the expense of the whole. So again, it takes only small things into account. It's the you that is looking at a car going down the road, noticing its hubcap is missing. So instead of seeing what the car and what it means and its relationship with the person, you just see the specifics, the details. Instead of saying, wow, that beautiful machine is what enables us to get from place to place. Like, we get to work. We can accomplish so much more because of these technologies. So the left hemisphere, again, is like, it's another aspect of what people consider like the devil, judgment. It's addictive. So it's the hemisphere of addiction. I don't even know if I have that written on here. So it's addicted to things. It wants to control things. It wants to manipulate them. It's the side that has your voice. So like it's what used to talk, write, and read. That's all going through your left hemisphere. Your right hemisphere is almost not involved in that until it's transferred to it. Like, yes, it's taking in the information, but it's not, much of it's not getting processed. It's just delivering that back to the left hemisphere, unless it draws a connection between something it sees, and then it's like, okay, here's the connection. I'm going to relay that to the left hemisphere. So most of the analytical thinking when you're reading is of the left hemisphere, which is why a lot of my videos, or I want this to be in video format so people can think more openly with their right hemisphere. So it has a memory for facts, predetermined thinking. It disembodies things in an abstract, fungible, mechanical, and lifeless way. So it's mechanical in nature. It sees things as steps. So it doesn't see like the flow of time. It sees like steps in time. Like here, this is when, the Battle of the Bulge happened. It doesn't see the flow between all the things that happened in the war that led up to that. So it sees like those segments, and it would want, what it would want to do is keep going down into smaller and smaller segments within that, in that reductionist regressive way. It would try to keep looking at smaller and smaller details. That's what the left brain does, but the right brain prevents it from going too far. It's like, if you keep going further into detail, you're eventually just going to lose any semblance of meaning or anything. It's like, if you're looking at the strings of energy involved in the Battle of the Bulge, you don't really see anything. There's nothing there to give it meaning or understand what's going on. The dynamic between people, which are like holes. We see people as holes with the right hemisphere. So it is predetermined thinking. It thinks everything's predetermined. Representational understanding of the world. Again, it doesn't create a one-to-one map, but a map of reality that's as close as it can get, as close as you train it to get, to accurately represent the world. So that's both an actual physical relationship with everything, as well as the abstractions that are involved in reality. So like, if you were to come up with answers for things like, well, this is a philosophy I live by, utilitarianism. It's like, well, it's a map of the world, but it's like, it's not taking enough into account. Pleasure and pain is most of utilitarianism, and it does not take enough things into account or understand the way the world actually works. Self-assurance and tendency to blame others. So it's sure of itself, and it blames others when it's wrong. It's where anger resides. It has cognitive dissonance, so it can hold two things that are opposing each other simultaneously. Your right hemisphere doesn't do this. It takes everything into account. It understands that it can't be absolutely sure of itself, but the left hemisphere is where anger resides. And that's why if somebody's ever getting angry, they're trying to control the situation. They're trying to manipulate. They're trying to do things that are of the left hemisphere. And obviously when I'm listing these things out, these are all plain. So it doesn't give you a full understanding of the extreme of how you would represent this hemisphere in different situations. Because you could kind of say your left hemisphere, you can relate it to like almost animals, right? So your left hemisphere would be like very analytical. And I would say it's like a lion. So it's like it's trying to eat things. It's trying to simplify them and make them tangible and like consume. And addiction, it's seductive and addictive in nature, right? It's anger and cognitive dissonance. So when you put all this together and try to understand the difference, it's like if your right hemisphere is more like a puppy or a sheepdog, depending on its maturity level. So if it's a puppy, it's easily depressed. That's another thing, is the right hemisphere is easily depressed, and it's where our depression lies, because our left hemisphere can control it and stop our right hemisphere from functioning much better than the right hemisphere stops the other. And in doing so, we can become depressed. So this is not an all-inclusive list, but it gives you some idea of like, oh, the left hemisphere is in its, when it goes wrong or gets out of hand, it is what people refer to as the hemisphere of sin, but it's also of science. It's also of things that can be good as long as they're in service of the right hemisphere. And like love is of the right hemisphere. And this list does not do enough to kind of understand, because it's the left hemisphere is also of relationships, or the right hemisphere is of relationships. It's also of love, because you can't love something unless you're drawing a connection between you and it. Like you can't simplify love into a rationalization. It's impossible. It's both an intuition you get and in relation to something. So it's reciprocal. So love is a relationship, reciprocal, and it's cooperative. So it's all of these things. And if you to define love without saying it's all these things besides just a feeling, it's like this is how it manifests in reality, or manifests in cooperation, like two people trying to achieve something together. So if you're in a relationship with somebody, it's your wife, girlfriend, whatever, you're trying to cooperate to achieve some end. Obviously, hopefully it's not in the end for the end of hedonistic pleasure, but for the end of achieving a goal of having children and building a family and building a community, which is why so many religious individuals argue against like gay marriage. It's like, this is why. I'm not saying it's wrong or right. I'm just saying this is why they do, because they're of the right hemisphere, which is religious. They're drawing the connections between, well, what is the point of a relationship if not to procreate? Like, you're just engaging in that hedonistic left hemisphere addiction and pleasure seeking, and without taking anything else into account. But obviously, people are born with these tendencies. A lot of it's due to the way their genetics line up, or even some abuse during their childhood, whatever the case may be. It's like, we don't have to hate you because of it, because of your suffering, but in opening your mind up, you can still have a loving relationship with another person who's of your like mind. And life doesn't have to be perfect. It's just, as long as you understand all this stuff and try to take it into account, and you're of the right hemisphere, even if you're, like a homosexual, it doesn't matter in the end. Because if you try to just live your best life according to everything that we know, instead of just engaging in that hedonistic pleasure gratification, and you have sex for the sake of that bond building rather than just pleasure, then you're doing it for the right reasons. And obviously we do the bond building for the sake of procreation as well, but And everything comes back to evolution. Everything comes back to procreation and evolution and trying to survive. So it's like we can simplify and reduce it to that, but that's also a left hemispheric rationalization. It's like, here's the most simple answer to why everything happens. And we both need that thinking and the other thinking, which would be there's more to that, more to life than just that. There's, there's all these other aspects that we can't reduce it to just procreation, because we lose the meaning of why we procreate. It's like, okay, if life is just procreation, survival, etc., well, then what's the meaning of doing that? Like, what is the reason we would do that? Well, it's because the universe's fundamental trajectory is that of reciprocal cooperation, or else we would have no reason to go against entropy. The universe would not go against entropy if that was not the case. Like, there's there's no mathematical formula that says the universe had to be this way. It was just the universe that's the nature of the universe. And that's the connections that you draw when you understand it. Understand that, why would it go against entropy? Entropy it makes sense for things to fall apart rather than come together. And everything just keeps coming together more and more at different levels. So at first we had, energy formed atoms formed, there's probably smaller parts I'm not getting at, but it's like, to simplify, I already went over this, everything keeps coming together into higher and higher forms. And now we are of the form of life cooperating with other life. And that's the next form of cooperation. So what we are trying to get to as a civilization, as a species, is the next level of cooperation. And who knows how many levels of cooperation that we'll be able to get to, because there's things that are so far outside our understanding and the way the world could work in the future. But there's another level of reciprocal cooperation that we're going to figure out over time. And that's the next stage of our universe. It's going to be that. So there is the left and right hemisphere. It's not a complete it's a rationalized version of both, right? So, when you understand these differences, you can understand the connections that I'm drawing between them. So everything that has to do with religion, everything that has to do with traditionalists or conservatives, it's like that the way they think about the world is through that right hemisphere. They try to take as many things into account before they make decisions. And it even manifests in moral foundations theory. It's like when they look at, I'm going to eventually quote them and cite them, but Jonathan Haidt's work, and I think Graham, I forgot his name, but they created a framework to understand the differences in moral foundations that they come to, and it based on the English lexicon. And they found that conservatives take they're evenly across the board, and then liberals, they only take one thing into account, and that's mostly just care and harm. And obviously some of them take only one other thing into account, whether or not something's fair or not. But for the most part, care and harm seems to be the most straightforward, simplistic rationalization of specificity that they can also apply to data, because they can look at the outcome and be like, here's all the people that it's harming, but it's an overly simplistic view of the way the world works. It doesn't take enough into account. So eventually I'm also going to go into how these map onto the left and right of our conservatives and liberals in the United States, because in a free society, you would expect the largest differences between people to manifest. So it's what are the largest differences? Well, there's sex. So sex is one of the largest differences in the way we think as humans. And the other thing is our left and right brain lateralization. So those are two overlapping ways of thinking. And a lot of it's left hemisphere is male, right hemisphere is female more. So more males are left hemisphere, more females are right hemisphere. And then it's like, how do I reconcile that with liberals being more female? And because that's more of a rationalist way of thinking. And I kind of go over that. So it's like the left there's two reasons why people are more more liberal. So there's an intuitive reason and there's a rationalization, and the same for conservatives. And that's where I think it lies. Most of the difference is like, so I will go over that in another video with you guys as well. So thank you guys so much. I love you. Hope you learned something. All right. Bye.